Good afternoon, and welcome to this latest talk in the UBC Migration Speaker Series. My name is Antje Ellerman, and I'm the co-director of UBC Migration and Associate Professor of Political Science here at the University of British Columbia. I would like to acknowledge that UBC is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. My own home, from which I join today, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and I'm grateful to be able to live and work on this beautiful land. Please follow UBC Migration on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is up on the PowerPoint slide. It's at UBC Migration, and do feel free to tweet and tag us during this talk. This talk is being recorded, with the exception of the Q&A period at the end. And after the presentation, you can ask questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you prefer to remain anonymous, you can click the appropriate button as you type your question. And you also will have the option of upvoting questions that you're really interested in that others have asked by clicking the thumbs up feature. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Daniel Hiebert is a professor of geography here at UBC who specializes in issues of public policy. His research interests focus on immigration policy, the integration of newcomers into the housing and labor markets of Canadian cities, and the consequences of the growing superdiversity of Canadian society. His work routinely takes a collaborative approach, working with partners in government and non-government associate organizations. And here at UBC, Dan supports our work by serving as our policy liaison and coordinating our policy outreach. He will share with us today his latest work on the many ways in which COVID-19 has impacted on Canadian immigration policy. And I believe he may even venture some tentative predictions of where we're headed. I look forward to what you have to share, Dan. So over to you.
There, I think people can hear me now. All right, thanks very much everyone for coming, and thanks also for the organizers for inviting me to give this presentation. As Antje kind of indicated, this is very fresh work. I'm just really trying to keep up with what's going on, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, so the agenda that I'm going to follow for the next 45 minutes or so is first to talk about just how profound an issue COVID is when it comes to issues of migration. Then I'd like to take a few minutes to reflect back on what happened during the economic crises of the 1980s and 1990s and how the government of Canada chose to coordinate its immigration policy to those economic events. Then talk about what IRCC is doing right now and how that is working out. Then give you a bit of an update on data, and those will be quite detailed slides that will come at you quite quickly. And what I've already done is sent a copy of this presentation to the organizers so that people can, if they wish, request a copy of the slide set, so you don't have to worry about, if things flip by too quickly for you to catch. And then, as Antje said at the end of her introduction, I will venture a few comments on, well, first of all, the policy options of the near future, but also the options that I think are more plausible and those that are less plausible. And I want to give a little bit of a warning. This is going to be a very descriptive presentation. I'm kind of selective in what I'm choosing to show. That reflects the kinds of things I'm interested in. It's going to be kind of impressionistic, especially my view of the policy options in the future. And ultimately, I'm going to be offering you more questions than answers because, of course, we don't know exactly where things are going. Okay, so I'll start then with this idea of COVID as a triple threat. And we all know about two of those threats, and I think we don't think enough about the third. The health threat is painfully obvious. The fact that COVID represents an economic crisis is also painfully obvious. But what I think people have not appreciated quite enough is the extent to which COVID represents what you could call an equity crisis or a humanitarian crisis. And you know, the core of this issue is that people in groups that are already suffering marginalization tend to suffer more marginalization during a pandemic. And of course, the converse is true. People who are already privileged tend to suffer less during a pandemic. So what does that look like? Given the density of slides of my presentation, I'll dispense with this one very quickly, but it's just a reminder of how devastating the health aspects of COVID have been. You can see on the bottom of the right, the Canadian number of cases per day. It's been rising, especially alarmingly in the recent past. On the bottom left, you see the global case size. Okay, COVID is an economic crisis. Again, I know you know this, but it's worth just explicating a few points about it. One is, it's kind of a two-faceted crisis. On the one hand, there's the economic contraction, and that's related to also the diminishing labor market opportunities for people as unemployment rises. And on the other facet, it's also a fiscal crisis in terms of the huge debt that is being accumulated during this particular point in time. As I think you'll all already know from news reports, Canada is going to probably hit a $1 trillion federal deficit by the end of this fiscal year, which is really quite extraordinary. But on the labor market side, just draw your attention to the most recent numbers from the labor force survey that were just released a few days ago. We can see the biggest economic contraction has been in accommodation and food services, retail, and construction. And you probably, as soon as you hear those sectors mentioned, will already be thinking to yourself, isn't that where lots of immigrants find work? And that relates to the point about the equity side of the crisis. But before I get to that, one more slide on the economic dimensions of COVID. So I just took a little while to try to compare the COVID situation with respect to the economy with what happened during the last three crises of the 80s, the 90s, and the end of the 2000s. And I pulled a graph, a monthly unemployment graph out of Statistics Canada, and I looked what was the worst unemployment at the peak month of each of these crises. And in 1983, it was 13.1%. In 1994, it was 12.1%. And in 2010, it was 8.7%. So that's one point I want to come back to in a second. But before I do, I also looked at the time it took to recover to pre-recession unemployment rates. And in these three crises that have happened recently, it took 6, and 8 years. So the onset of the crisis is quick. The return to a better economic times is slow. And that's the case in each of the crises we've seen in the recent past. And one other thing to say about those other three crises, Statistics Canada gave us a very worrying statistic, which is although people were told that they were losing their job temporarily, nearly half of all people who lost their jobs that were considered to be temporary actually turned out to be permanent job losses. So when the economy recovers, there's a big shift in the labor market. So individuals can be left behind in that shift, which can be really a devastating kind of thing on a personal level. So then that's the past. What about now? So of course, we can't have a graph like this yet for COVID, but I've tried to just add together the most recent StatCan information on top of the historical StatCan information. It's not a perfect match, but it's kind of close enough. And what we found is peak unemployment in this COVID crisis was in May of this year. Well, let's hope that's peak unemployment and it doesn't come back. And that was 13.7%. So actually worse than at any of the other recent crises. And in fact, it's the worst level of unemployment since the 1930s. Oh, but the other point that's worth noting is the recovery has also been very rapid. So if the unemployment peaked at 13.7% in May, just a few months later in September, it was down to 9%. So we've never seen such a steep rise in unemployment so quickly, nor have we ever seen such a restoration of employment so quickly. So we're in uncharted territory. Now, on the equity side, so the third dimension of the COVID crisis, I've got a take on that early in the crisis, and then one from more recently. The early take is from, again, the Canada Labour Force Survey. It looks at what happened. It looks at what happened between February and April, when unemployment was really cascading upward, employment was cascading downward. And for the Canadian-born population of Canada, that population lost 14% of its employment in that just 2-month period. But it was much worse for immigrants. So those immigrants who'd been in Canada at least 10 years, 17% of them lost their jobs. For those who've been in Canada between 5 and 10 years, a little more than 17% lost their jobs. And for very recent immigrants who'd only been in Canada up to 5 years, over 23% lost their jobs. So there was a gradient of severity in terms of who was bearing the brunt of this economic catastrophe, and it was really more weighted towards immigrants. And then there's a second dimension on this equity side. Just among the immigrant population in Canada, 15.5% of men lost their jobs, but 21% of immigrant women lost their jobs. So it tells us a little bit that, crises impact different populations differentially, and marginalized populations face worse kinds of problems. Then if we go to the most recent data, since July, Statistics Canada has been asking what they call the visible minority question in the labor force survey, which is a new thing, and it relates to widespread concerns over equity that have been emerging with respect to Black Lives Matter and so forth. And we now get a kind of clear picture of the differential unemployment rate across the population groups that are identified in that particular question. And for this amorphous group, I really wish Statistics Canada would not be incorporating Indigenous and white people together in one category, but that's what they're doing. You can see that category has the lowest unemployment. The light blue is August, the dark blue is September, and every other racialized group has a higher rate of unemployment to the point where Arab Canadians have double the unemployment rate of the not visible minority population. So that again gives a sense of the equity kinds of issues embedded in a crisis like COVID. And another side of this, of course, has to do with the degree of risk that different populations face in terms of contracting COVID. The Toronto Star gave us a couple of really helpful maps a few weeks ago that indicate the landscape of the Black population in Toronto, according to the 2016 census, juxtaposed against the neighborhoods with the highest burden of COVID-19. And you can see it's not like a perfectly aligned set of images, but pretty close. And of course, this doesn't tell us that, I don't know, Black people sneeze more often. It doesn't tell us that Black people refuse to wear masks more often. What it tells us instead is that Black people are in positions in the labor market that put them at higher risk, positions in the labor market that put them at higher risk. Also, they tend to live in more crowded residential settings. So their risk of contracting COVID is higher than the rest of the population. That's another element of the equity side of the COVID crisis. And that plays out hugely when we look at the global scale. And that's where I get to that terminology of the humanitarian crisis. What we're seeing now are vast numbers of stranded labor markets throughout the labor migrants throughout the world. Just as one example that was raised recently by the UNHCR, there are 250,000 Indian labor migrants in the Gulf states that can't go home and can't do work. So they're stuck in transit camps under really poor conditions. So that's just one element of it. Another element is we're seeing growing evidence of severe food security issues among refugees. The particular most recent piece I read on this had to do with the country of Uganda, which is hosting somewhere close to 100,000 refugees from Congo, from Sudan, and so forth. And that population is facing starvation levels of malnourishment at the present time. It's just tragic what is going on there. Also, the world's the whole global asylum system has been basically blocked up. 168 countries have some form of border closure, from a relatively, selective to full kinds of border closures. 70 countries in the world have suspended their asylum determination systems. And there are many, dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of refoulement that are happening. For example, ships not being allowed to dock, ships that are carrying asylum seekers not being allowed to dock at ports, water cannons being used along borders and so forth. And I've just given a couple of indications of some of the articles, the many articles that are coming out on these kinds of issues. So there's this humanitarian crisis element of COVID as well. So the things we ought to be worried about, of course, are the disease itself, and then all of the medical complications that can accompany the disease, such as mental health issues. We're seeing rising numbers on that front as well. We need to be worried about the economic hangover of COVID in terms of heightened unemployment and colossal debt loads that suggest we will be entering a period of fiscal austerity in the near future. And we have to be considering issues of increased inequality and lingering humanitarian issues that are not going to go away quickly. So we've got a real problem on our hands, and it's a multifaceted, multidimensional problem. Okay, so what happens to Canadian immigration when these kinds of things occur? And so I'll start with a bit of recent history and then move into the COVID era. So what I've done here is a very simple thing. I just juxtapose two graphs. The upper one is on the scale of permanent immigration to Canada from 1980 to 2018. And you get a little bit of a sense of the composition of that. The darkest color are those who came through humanitarian gateways. Then the middle color from those who came through family reunification. And the brightest green are those who came through economic programs. And I've juxtaposed that at the bottom. I've just stretched to fit the monthly unemployment rate from Statistics Canada for the same period. It's not a perfect fit, but it kind of works. And then I've thrown up these red lines to indicate, so what did it look like in the 80s economic recession, the 90s recession? And that's the real comparison that I think is so interesting. In the 80s, you can see there's a kind of reverse image on, well, there's two things to talk about. One is levels and then later composition. On the level side, in the 80s, there's almost a perfect reversal, right? So unemployment goes up, numbers come down. Unemployment is peaks, numbers are in a trough. Unemployment improves, numbers go up. So we got just a perfect reverse image there. Whereas in the 90s, it looks really different, right? So unemployment goes up, numbers go up. Unemployment goes down, numbers go down. So now that actually is illusory because what happened in the 90s was not so much that Canada reduced its targets for immigration. In fact, the targets remained about the same. What happened instead was this was the last time we've had like a supply collapse in terms of Canada's immigration system. In 1998, there was something, I'm almost reluctant to say it, but there was something called the Asian flu, which of course now is a term that people are very careful not to use. But it was used then to describe the fact that there was a stock market, very serious contraction in the late 1990s in Asia. And for a short period of time, Canada would send invitations for immigration to people in Asia, but not very many came. So the fact that there was a downturn in numbers was a supply issue, not a demand issue. Canada's willingness to take on immigrants remained about constant through this period. So think of this as being a constant line rather than a line that goes down, and contrast the 80s with the 90s. So in the 80s, the idea was when you have an economic contraction, you contract immigration so as not to overstock the labor market and make the unemployment problem worse. In the 90s, a totally different mentality came about, which was that if you select immigration according to economic ends, you'll end up having your immigration support economic recovery rather than continue to damage the economy. So it's a very different philosophy. And that's also incorporated in the compositional issues that change quite a bit. So what happened in the 80s, refugee numbers stayed about constant and then finally began to rise toward the end of the decade. Family numbers, they shrank a little, but not a huge amount. But the big shrinkage, especially in the early phase, was for the economic class. And why was that? Because in the 80s, the prevailing view was that humanitarian and family immigration were more or less tied to human rights. And therefore, the flexible form of immigration was economic. So if you were going to reduce immigration, you reduce the economic side of immigration. And they did that very simply by saying nobody could come to Canada as an economic class immigrant unless they had a job offer. And of course, the economy had contracted and nobody was getting job offers. So you saw a big collapse in the number of economic immigrants. In the 90s, on the other hand, you get a very different philosophy. Like I said, the prevailing view was if you select immigration with the economy in mind, you'll have good economic outcomes. And that means bolstering the economic side of it. So we see falling numbers of humanitarian immigrants, falling numbers of family immigrants, and slightly rising, but actually, according to the targets, they would have been much more rapidly rising numbers of economic immigrants through this period. So it's really useful to keep those two mindsets in our heads when thinking about what might happen in the near future. This is a slide that just basically goes into some more explanation of what I said, so I can just skip it and move on. Interestingly, that was not the case for temporary migration, right? So what we looked at a minute ago was permanent immigrants coming to Canada. What about temporary folks? And here, you might think that I've actually used some kind of running 3 or 5 year average to smooth out the data on this particular diagram, but I didn't. This diagram is just annual numbers, and it just shows a smooth increase in temporary migration, regardless of economic circumstances. You get a big rise of unemployment in the 80s, nothing happens in terms of temporary migration. A little bit of a blip toward the end of the decade, but that's a different issue. Then you get a big rise in unemployment in the 90s. Again, the line is just fairly straightforward. Then we see rising temporary migration from, well, basically in this century, regardless of what's happening in terms of the unemployment situation. So temporary migration has been much more resilient to economic cycles than permanent immigration has. All right, to sum up this part of the talk, immigrants and members of racialized groups face the most severe challenges in the labor market. And that's because the sectors with the highest immigrant or visible minority participation tend to be the hardest hit. Therefore, arriving newcomers face the biggest challenges, and you could call it a double challenge of being both new and being culturally different, so high ratio of racialized minorities within that group. And you could also layer on the fact that women newcomers face a triple challenge in that respect. And these disadvantages can produce scarring effects that can endure, right? So if you come in to Canada at a really difficult economic time, you are then forced to take a really poor job that may be much below your qualifications, your capabilities, and that can have a scarring effect that lasts for as long as a decade or more. And therefore, the larger the incoming cohort during an economic downturn, the larger these impacts, but particularly on immigrants, not so much on the Canadian-born, but particularly on immigrants. And one of the things we should think about is whether the demographic situation has changed enough between the 80s and 90s for the nature of these impacts to change in the 2020s. We have a quite different demographic context than we did 40 years ago. That's worth talking about later. Okay, now that's what the past tells us. What about now? So we're in a completely unprecedented situation with respect to immigration management in Canada. We are in a situation where, for the first time in Canadian history, two things have coincided. One, there's an economic crisis, and two, IRCC has lost much of its processing capacity. And we can add to that a third thing that's never happened before. We've got well, it has happened in World War II, but hasn't happened in a long time. We've got border closures. So what happened in mid-March? Mid-March, suddenly, just like at UBC, just like in many other institutions, the federal government told its employees to go home and to work from home. IRCC, over 8,000 employees, suddenly they go from 100% of those employees pretty much working in offices to about 3 to 5% of those employees working in offices. They have to scatter across Ottawa and the rest of the country. Some of them have great places to work in their homes. They have, studies or offices. Others are in cramped apartments, working off the kitchen table or the coffee table in the living room. They're working with sensitive, highly private documents. Maybe they don't have up-to-date computers. And what people talk about throughout the economy is the idea of a COVID productivity tax. And this was faced very significantly by IRCC, with the majority of its staff working from home and slowly getting geared up to be able to really do the full kind of nature of their jobs. And this was especially a problem with those components of the immigration system that require in-person contact or the movement of paper. It's easier to have this new distributed workforce if everything's digital, but some things are still based on the movement of paper. And probably the most prominent example would be medical tests, right? So you have to have a medical test before you can be approved to come to Canada. And that has to be with a doctor literally laying hands on you. And also it produces a piece of paper, a certificate signed, with a pen by the medical professional. Partly you can fix these issues through mass digitization of records, and IRCC has hired a big digital company to come in and try to convert everything they've got. But you can't do everything. Some parts of the process still need in-person kinds of meetings. There's another thing which I don't have time to talk about now, but IRCC has implemented something called virtual landings. Maybe in the discussion session later, we can talk about what that looks like. So anyway, you take all of this new context, and what does it mean for what's happening right now to immigration during COVID? The planned level for 2020 was 341,000 people coming to Canada as permanent immigrants. But given the shortfalls that have occurred since March, the latest expectation, I've spoken with 3 different executive members of IRCC over the last 10 days or so, and I've got 3 different stories, but they kind of converge around the same number. Somewhere between 190 and 200,000 people are expected to show up in 2020, which is somewhere between a 40 and 45% reduction from what was expected this year. Now, my personal comment is, given the state of the Canadian labor market, that was perhaps a good thing. But nevertheless, the really important point is what I got at the bottom of the slide, and that is, unlike the 1980s, this wasn't a conscious choice by IRCC. Nobody sat down and said, oh, let's reduce the number of people admitted to Canada this year. It was purely because of things that happened outside of IRCC's control. The border gets closed and their workforce scatters and just can't do the job that they're normally doing. So this was a contingent kind of outcome rather than a planned outcome. Okay, but nevertheless, maybe up to 200,000 people are being admitted. So who are they? How do you admit people through immigration into a country during a global pandemic? How does that actually work? And partly you do that through admitting people who are already here, so they don't have to cross a border. And that's done by taking people who are in Canada under some form of a temporary resident visa and upgrading their visa to a permanent resident visa. And this could be through the provincial nominee program. It could be through the Canadian Experience class. There's a few other possibilities of family reunification and other kinds of ways to do this. But if you're drawing on people who are already in Canada, you don't have to worry about a closed border. Oh, and by the way, as I point out on the slide, the Immigration and Refugee Board has recently resumed in-person hearings as well for asylum seekers. So it hasn't happened yet, but there'll be some people moving through that particular system. The other thing that IRCC did when it shut the border, when Canada shut the border in mid to late March on the 18th, they said that anyone who had received immigration approval prior to March the 18th could still show up at a Canadian border and be given the right to land. So the only people who were prohibited from landing were those who were going to be receiving their invitation letter after March the 18th. So you could still see people arriving that had been granted the right to land in December, January, February, whatever. So that continued to happen through the COVID period. So that's on the permanent resident side. On the temporary resident side, Canada placed priority on individuals who are deemed essential. And I tell just a tiny story here. I found it so interesting that early in the COVID crisis, I think it was April sometime, I happened to be chatting with one of the executive members of IRCC, and I said, hey, my department is hiring a couple of people. Are they going to be allowed to come into Canada and start teaching in September? And the answer was quite interesting. The answer was, well, after we let in all the truck drivers we need and the people who are cleaning hospitals and people who are going to be picking fruit and vegetables and so forth, once we get all those essential people through, then maybe we'll have time to admit people who are not so essential, like university professors. I thought that was a very interesting and telling point about the nature of work and the world. Outside these categories, that is outside the people who are doing transitional visas, the people who were approved prior to March the 18th, and people who are deemed essential, there's been relatively few people being allowed into Canada. Okay, and that leads then to, what does that look like? What kind of data are we seeing on people coming through at this point in time? And now the talk is going to be a bit maybe overwhelming. I'm going to show a bunch of data on temporary residents coming into Canada, permanent residents coming in, those transitions I've been speaking about. I'll take a tiny detour to the provincial scale from the national scale and look at BC, and then finally talk a little bit about impacts on the delivery of settlement services. So starting with the temporary resident side of all this, of course, there's three main forms of temporary residence in Canada: coming to study, coming to work, or coming to claim asylum. So I'll show you each of those in turn. Oh, and by the way, one of the things that I've been very fortunate about is IRCC agreed to share with me and a couple of other people I'm working with on this project data on who's clicking on their website to get information to come to Canada. And so we've been getting a sense of how that kind of global interest is shaping up. All right, so this is a very busy slide. I won't go into the details of it, but this is study permits that have been given on a monthly basis from 2018 to August of 2020. So it's fairly up to date. We're only about a month and a half behind. And what I would emphasize here is the annual rhythm. For obvious reasons, excuse me, for obvious reasons, there's a big lump of people who come at the beginning of the academic year in August each year, with a little bit of a flow through into September, but August is always the big month. So in 2018, that was like 90,000 people. In 2019, it was even bigger. It was like 110 or 12,000 people. But in 2020, you've really seen a collapse of that. And in part, of course, that's because universities have and other higher education institutions in Canada have mainly gone to online forms of learning. There's much less justification for students to come under those circumstances. And those numbers have really fallen downward to about 40,000 in the peak month for 2020. So a big drop on this particular side of things. Now, then I was thinking, what about compositional stuff? Like, where are people coming from? And so this slide indicates it in a rather unreadable way, but this one is perhaps a little bit more useful. So these are the top 15 source countries of international students coming to Canada for all of 2019, and then for the first 8 months of 2020. And the simple thing to point out here is the lists, first of all, are exactly the same 15 top countries in both periods, and even more or less in the same ranked order. So France has gone down a little in terms of its rank. Iran has gone up a little in terms of its rank, but basically there's little more than a one rank shift across those two lists. So basically everything has shrunk, and it hasn't had a big compositional effect in terms of where international students are coming from. In terms of the interest that people are showing from around the world on coming to Canada as an international student, you can see there's been a little bit less utilization of IRCC's website in 2020. Oh, and by the way, these data are very recent. They go right up to the end of September of this year. There's a little bit less interest this year than there was last year, but it's not huge. Compared to the drop in numbers, it's not huge, which of course suggests that once Canada reopens itself, things might return to what we've seen in the past relatively quickly. Okay, that's the study side. Now the labor side. Most of you probably already know this, but generally speaking, we've got sort of two main kinds of labor migrants. There are those who have to go through a labor market impact assessment process, and those are called temporary foreign workers. And I've got three subcategories of those: caregivers, agricultural workers, and other. And then there are those that come through what is called the International Mobility Program. This is a program for people who do not have to submit a labor market approval kind of process. They're based on agreements Canada has with other countries like NAFTA. They're based on things that are considered in Canada's best interest. And then there's a few extras as well. And the important categories in terms of continuity have been agricultural workers and Canadian interests. So Canada is basically bringing in the temporary labor migrants that it deems most essential. And so look at the agricultural side of it for a minute. That's the middle color of blue. And you can see, unlike students, the big era of any given year for that is the summer months, right? From April to July. And here's 2018, here's 2019, and here's 2020. They look much the same, especially 2020 and 2019. So those workers have been deemed absolutely essential, and Canada's done whatever it takes to allow them in. Same thing with the middle green color of international mobility in Canada's interest. You can see those numbers have been pretty robust. A better way, in a second I'll get to a better way. Well, let me just reverse order here. This gives you a sense of, I've taken the key months of COVID in 2020, the corresponding months of 2019, and compared them and given a little index value. And you can see agricultural workers, same. It hasn't changed between 2019 and 2020. And also the Canadian interest folks are coming in at relatively robust numbers, and then lesser across other temporary labor and study categories. This gives you a sense that there's still strong interest in coming to Canada to work temporarily, but it's not quite as robust as what we were seeing with the interest by international or prospective international students. And then lastly, on the temporary side, what about asylum? And here we've seen like a real problem, a real drop in numbers. So the gold or yellow colored line is overall numbers of asylum seekers that have come to Canada. And in a typical month through 2019, we've seen about 5,000, maybe a little more typically come in per month. And now during COVID, it's more like 1,500, well, even down to 1,000, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500. So that's a reduction by 3/4, something like that. Also, you can see the mechanisms of entering Canada have really shifted. Until the COVID emergency, a lot of people were coming by airport arrivals. That's gone. was just like a tiny bit in August, but generally speaking, that's gone. Also, a lot of people just showed up at the border. That almost came to zero in April. It's been very slowly recovering. But the main story now are people who are already in Canada who make an asylum claim. So inland asylum claims is mainly the pathway that people are using now. So big changes there. And in terms of what does that look like across the different countries of the world, it's had the biggest impact on people from African countries. Look at, for example, Nigeria. The blue line is 2019. The orange line is 2020. You can see just what a huge drop in numbers that has been. You can also see, Egypt. You can see Angola and so forth. Ethiopia, Uganda. African countries have absolutely collapsed because there's not many Africans in Canada, comparatively speaking. Whereas people from Mexico, Iran, or India, again, there have been very large drops in numbers, but they haven't completely collapsed in quite the same way. So if we look at temporary residence then from a historical comparison, in the past, previous recessions have had very little impact on temporary resident numbers, but this time the impact is quite substantial but varied. Essential workers have the least impact. Less essential workers have more impact. Study visas are down by half, and asylum visas are down by 3/4, if not more. And I'd like you to connect that with the concept of the global humanitarian crisis. This is, you could say, this is Canada's share, in a way, of the global humanitarian crisis that we're seeing unfolding writ large. All right, that's the temporary side. Now I'm going to shift our attention to permanent residents. And I think I might skip the BC side of this because just to keep to time as much as I can. So first of all, this is the permanent resident kind of pattern. There tends to be an annual rise in the summer months and then a little bit of a slowdown. People don't seem to like to come to Canada's winter. Then again, it rises in the summer months and slows down. And then for 2020, it started to rise and then it collapsed. And so April is the month when IRCC had scattered, when the borders were closed and so forth. So what was typically around about 25, 6, 7,000 people coming per month suddenly goes down to 4,000 people. And then it slowly builds and then interestingly takes another downward turn after June, right? So you saw quite a bit of recovery between April and June and then some softness in July and August. And let's think about why that was the case in a minute, but let me just give you a bit more information before I do that. This one, I think it's hard to see compositional issues here, but I've highlighted them here. Sorry, this is a busy table, but you only have to look at 2 columns. One is, this is the average number coming per month from January of 2018 to February of 2020, just before the COVID crisis begins. And then this last column takes the COVID months, so from April to August, and indexes them to those pre-COVID months. And across all categories, there's been about a 57% drop in numbers, but it's been uneven. And the numbers have been most robust in the economic categories. Blue is economic, yellow is family, and green is refugee. Sorry, there we are. So the drop for economic has been about 45 to 50% in the main economic categories. It's been about 2/3 for family, and it's been about 3/4 for refugees. So that's gives you a sense there's been not only a drop in levels, but a compositional effect. And that kind of takes us back to the philosophy of the 1990s, right? So if you keep bolstering the economic side of things, you might get more positive effects from a policy point of view. In terms of where people are coming from, this is a sense of change between, in the first instance, 2018 and 19, so before COVID. Then we were seeing a rise in the number of people coming from Africa and Southern Asia, and a fall, particularly in Southeast Asian countries. And then this is the year of COVID, so to speak. And there we are seeing a rise in people from the Americas and people from Western Europe. And there looks to be kind of a pattern that you could say is whitening immigration. But I think that's a bit illusory because it really bounces around month by month. This is just comparing August of 2020 versus August of 2019. And you can see the big story here is a growth in African migration in August. So I think that it's too early to really know what these patterns are going to look like. The other thing to think about is transitions from temporary to permanent residence. And as I said before, these are people who are brought in based on earlier decisions and people who don't have to cross a border. Here I think is a kind of an interesting and important story. So the green line on this particular graph, is the percentage of people who have had some kind of visa. And unfortunately, that may include some double counting because some people have had more than one kind of visa. So the percentage of people who are brought in as permanent residents who have lived in Canada before under a temporary visa, and that's been roughly about 30% over the last couple of years, whereas it jumped to almost 70% during the height of COVID. And then it's been declining in the last couple of months. And I think the story about this is when the crisis emerged, IRCC put their energy into getting people through this transition to keep immigration going while the borders were shut, but they kind of are running out of those people. So that was the big emphasis during April, May, and June. But those numbers, I think, this is my interpretation, this is not from an interview from IRCC officials, it's my interpretation, but I think that the supply is falling and therefore there just aren't as many more people to convert as has been happening so far. Okay, I'm going to skip over the provincial scale just to try to keep on time. But I will say one thing before moving on to some concluding remarks. And that is that what we've been seeing in the recent past is a lot, like a much smaller number of people using immigrant settlement services. Unfortunately, the data aren't as recent. The public releases aren't as frequent for data on settlement service utilization as they are on admission numbers. So I can't go right up to August on this particular chart. I can only go to May. But you can see the two COVID months, April and May of 2020, we're seeing, compared to say, April and May of 2019 or April and May of 2018, we're seeing quite a big reduction in the utilization of those services, which may have some important implications for the future. All right, and then speaking of the future, that takes me now to what next? It's the last part of the presentation. So first thing to think about is for 2020, we've got a kind of missing cohort. Canada did not bring in about 140,000, maybe 150,000, as many people as was planned. Also, there's been a large shortfall of temporary residents coming to Canada as well. So another thing to consider is looking forward, Canada's economic recovery could take a long time or maybe a short time. Like maybe the fact that we had such a recovery of the labor market in July and August might mean, that might bode well for the future, or maybe not. Like it's really hard to say. But also on the economic side, I think we can expect a period of fiscal austerity coming down the pipe in the not too distant future. The biggest issues, of course, for the resumption of immigration and temporary migration are twofold. One is, when is the border going to reopen? And I think it's not going to be just simply on January the 1st of 2021. I just don't think it's going to work out that simply. I think that there will be continuing border closures, or at least partial border closures through some amount of time in 2021. It might be the middle of the year, really, before we see like a really open flowing border. Could even be later than that, who knows. The other really important issue is IRCC's levels plan. Obviously, the levels plan that was announced for 2020 has been completely broken. Soon, sometime we're told by the end of October, perhaps the first few days of November, Minister Mendicino is going to release his revised plan, and it'll probably be a 3-year plan from 2021 to 2024. What's that going to look like? Well, in large degree, it seems to me, it's going to depend on the theory of the relationship between immigration and the economy. And in particular, the theory between those two things that is held by the Liberal government of Canada. And if they go back to the 1980s view, the view would be that it's unwise to maintain a relatively high immigration intake during a recession and in the immediate aftermath of a recession. Or if they go back to the view of the 1990s, they will think, well, if we adjust immigration to be more economically focused, then it can stimulate the economy and propel economic growth. And therefore, we can go back to larger numbers as quickly as possible. And also, there's this added demographic case to be made for increased immigration. Now, not that they're necessarily listening, but what would the Liberal government be hearing if economists were allowed to speak? And economists would say, I think there might be some here on the listening to the talk, and if so, please feel free to challenge me on this. But I think economists would say that the government should be thinking not only about just increasing Canada's gross domestic product, but increasing its per capita gross domestic product. And the 1990s view works for the former of those things, but not the latter of those things. And there would be a really interesting conversation, I think, that could happen around that particular issue. Okay, so what are the policy options? Well, Minister Mendicino may go back to the 1980s and may come up with a choice that says we better maintain low numbers. We have low numbers out of just circumstances we couldn't control, but maybe that's a good thing, and we should keep those low numbers. Wait until we see signals that unemployment drops again, below 6 or 7%, before we really go back to significant immigration numbers. So that's one possible choice. A second would be to have a kind of slow planned recovery. So we're at, let's say, 60% in 2020, 70% in 2021, 80% in 2022, et cetera, et cetera. A third option would be to go with a fast recovery. So get back to the existing 3-year plan as quickly as possible, knowing that there'll be some shortfall again in 2021 at the beginning of the year, but really pile things up and make sure they get back to normal. Or there could be a sense of replacing that extra cohort in the next couple of years. So take that missing 140 or 150,000 and ramp up numbers in the very near future to kind of get back to where we would have been if COVID hadn't happened. And finally, there's what I would call the very bold option, which is to really embrace that idea of the 1990s and say that immigration is a form of economic stimulus. So the bigger, the better. And let's shift to this idea of building the nation through immigration. And by the way, that would coincide with advice that Prime Minister Trudeau heard when he was first elected. So he was first elected in late 2015. He called together a panel of economic advisors in 2016. They suggested to him, hey, we should have a higher level of immigration in Canada. Let's bring it up to 450,000 per year as soon as we can. And that will be stimulative to the Canadian economy, to society, et cetera, et cetera. That advice was kind of put on hold. Maybe now is the time the Liberals will choose to take that advice. I said I would give some sense of what I thought might happen. My sense is the first two choices are not going to happen. The third, I would probably, I think the most likely outcomes are any of the third, fourth, or fifth options. I think that the Liberals are keen to make up the extra the missing cohort. I think option 4 is quite likely, but I also think that the Liberals are searching for some way to galvanize the attention of Canadians, to give Canadians a sense that the future is going to be better than the past and so on. And I think, therefore, it's also kind of equally likely that they might take on a bold approach, and they might actually announce a couple of weeks from now that we're going to see much larger numbers of immigrants in the future. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen, but I think that's a very real possibility. Okay, having said that, what should we consider? This is my last slide, Antje, just so you know. Think about the equity crisis. What if immigration rebounds quickly, but employment doesn't? And in that case, who's going to suffer most in Canada? That's something that I think ought to be on everybody's minds, and to really consider what that might mean. Second thing is the maintenance of public confidence in policy. So far, public opinion has been relatively favorable to the idea of resuming immigration after the COVID crisis. And that may continue. I would say, I would hope that that continues. But at the same time, what I would like to see more of is a sense of what the government's communication plan is. I think the government needs to, when Minister Mendocino announces the view of basically the Prime Minister's office in, consultation with him, I suppose, I think if whatever that view is, whether it's slow recovery, fast recovery, or even enlargement of immigration, I think there needs to be a very clear rationale, and I think there needs to be a communication plan that enables Canadians to make sense of that particular plan. And finally, if the decision is made to raise numbers quickly, I think a key question is what investments are necessary, especially to try to prevent scarring effects on newcomers, and where are those investments going to come from if the cupboard seems bare, right? If the fiscal issues loom large in the public conversation. So that's another kind of challenge, especially of communication, but also a challenge of fiscal planning that I think we really need to see some evidence of when these plans are announced very quickly.